Security. Escort her out. We don't run a charity for lost orphans. The CEO's voice cut through the glass-walled boardroom like a blade. The quiet maintenance girl stood near the doorway, holding a worn toolkit against her chest while dozens of executives watched. Polished shoes, tailored suits, and gold cufflinks filled the room with silent judgment. The CEO fired the quiet maintenance girl in front of the entire company. He said she was just an orphan cleaning floors in a building meant for real talent. A few executives chuckled as security guards shifted forward. But she didn't argue. She just glanced at the sealed research wing behind them. Minutes later, alarms would erupt, and suddenly, everyone would need the girl they had just humiliated, because the systems trapping a child inside that lab were designed by someone she knew better than anyone alive. By the way, where are you watching from? Tell me in the comments below. This moment looked like a simple firing. But underneath the polished floors and towering glass walls of Hallstrom Dynamics, something far bigger had already started moving. Something none of the executives in that room could see, and the girl they had just dismissed was the only one who understood it. The room slowly settled back into silence. No one expected the maintenance girl to speak. No one expected her to move. But Elias Vale didn't look angry. She didn't plead. She simply stood there, calm in a room designed to intimidate people like her. Her uniform was plain gray, sleeves slightly rolled, the faint smell of machine oil clinging to the fabric. The toolkit in her hands looked older than most of the executives sitting around the table. Yet her eyes drifted toward the reinforced glass wall behind them, the one overlooking the robotics testing floor below. Did you not hear me? Victor Hallstrom snapped. The billionaire CEO leaned forward in his leather chair, irritation tightening his voice. You're fired. This floor is restricted. Maintenance staff don't wander into executive meetings. A guard stepped closer. Arya finally looked back at the man. For a moment, the room expected excuses. Instead, she nodded once. Understood. The simplicity of the response seemed to confuse people. Most workers begged when they lost jobs like this. Most people panicked when the most powerful man in the building humiliated them in front of the entire leadership team. But the maintenance girl didn't look broken. She looked thoughtful. Marcus Delane, the company's chief operations officer, noticed it first. Her gaze wasn't on the executives. It was still on the robotics wing. Beyond the glass wall stretched a vast laboratory floor where experimental machines rested beneath bright white lights. Robotic arms hung motionless above steel tables. Control panels blinked with quiet digital life. The research division was Hallstrom Dynamics' pride. Billions of dollars in cutting-edge automation technology lived behind that glass. And almost no one outside the engineering teams understood how it truly worked. Arya had spent months working night shifts in the service corridors beneath that very floor. Most people never noticed the hidden infrastructure running beneath a building like this. Cooling systems, power relays, backup circuits, maintenance tunnels that carried the silent heartbeat of the tower. She knew the sounds of those systems the way mechanics know the rhythm of engines. That was why something felt wrong. Even now, as executives stared at her with annoyance, she could hear it. A faint vibration beneath the polished floor. Subtle, uneven, like a machine trying to breathe through a clogged filter. Her grip tightened slightly around the metal handle of her toolkit. Victor Hallstrom misread the motion. "Oh, please," he scoffed. "Don't tell me you're about to argue about engineering systems, too." A few executives laughed again. Arya didn't respond. Because arguing wasn't the point, listening was. The vibration came again. Soft. 3 pulses. Then silence. Her mind automatically mapped the sound to the infrastructure layout beneath the robotics wing. Cooling relay channel. Sector C. That relay shouldn't be cycling like that, not during a controlled daytime test. She shifted her weight slightly. The movement caused Marcus to narrow his eyes. "What exactly were you doing up here anyway?" he asked. Victor waved a dismissive hand. "It doesn't matter, she's gone." The guard reached for the door. Arya finally spoke again. "Sir." Victor exhaled loudly. "What now?" The maintenance girl hesitated just long enough to make the room restless. Then she said quietly, "You might want to check the cooling relay under the robotics floor." A few engineers exchanged confused glances. Victor laughed outright. "You hear that?" he said, leaning back in his chair. "Now the janitor thinks she's an engineer." More laughter rippled across the table. Arya didn't react. Her gaze drifted once more toward the laboratory behind the glass. The vibration came again, longer this time. Somewhere deep below the research wing, a system was struggling, and systems rarely struggled quietly for long. She adjusted the strap of her toolkit. "Probably nothing," she said calmly. The guard opened the door behind her. Victor gestured toward it. "Then stop wasting our time." Arya turned toward the exit. For a moment, the room relaxed. The embarrassing interruption was over. The orphan maintenance girl was leaving. But just as she stepped into the hallway, a sharp electronic alarm exploded through the building. Red emergency lights flashed across the robotics floor, and every executive in the room froze. The alarm ripped through the hallway just as she stepped outside. A piercing siren echoed across the tower, vibrating through the glass walls and polished floors. Red emergency lights began flashing over the robotics wing behind the boardroom. Inside the room, chairs scraped violently as executives stood. "What the hell was that?" Marcus barked. Victor Hallstrom turned sharply toward the laboratory floor beyond the glass. Bright red warning strobes pulsed across the machines below, painting the room in urgent color. Another alarm joined the first, then another. Within seconds, the building sounded like a war zone of electronic panic. Engineers along the robotics floor started rushing between consoles. Screens lit up with warning signals. "Control room, report." Victor shouted. His phone vibrated violently in his hand. He answered immediately. "Yes?" The color drained from his face. "What do you mean she's inside?" Silence fell around the boardroom. Every executive watched him. Victor's voice dropped into something tight. "She's not supposed to be in the test chamber. Why would Lena be down there?" A pause. Then his tone hardened. "No, shut the system down." Now, another pause. His jaw clenched. "You're telling me you can't?" Marcus stepped closer. "Victor, what's happening?" The CEO lowered the phone slowly. "My niece," he said. "She's inside Lab Chamber 3, the words hung in the air like a bomb. Below them, the laboratory floor glowed under flashing emergency lights. Through the glass wall, they could see it clearly now. A sealed experimental robotics chamber had activated its lockdown protocols. Heavy reinforced doors had dropped into place. Inside the chamber, a small figure stood near a testing platform. A child. Lena Hallstrom looked tiny in the massive laboratory. She pressed both hands against the transparent barrier separating the chamber from the observation deck. Even from several floors above, her panic was visible. Marcus turned toward the engineers sprinting across the control stations below. "Override the lockdown," one of the technicians looked up helplessly. "We're trying." Victor slammed his hand against the glass wall. "Then try harder." Inside the chamber, robotic arms hung frozen above metal tables while red warning lights pulsed across the room. The system had completely sealed the environment. Oxygen circulation monitors flashed yellow, then orange. Marcus grabbed a communication tablet from the conference table. "What triggered the lockdown?" A frantic voice crackled through the device. "System Cascade failure. The cooling relay glitched and triggered automated containment protocols. Victor's head snapped toward the door, toward the hallway where the maintenance girl had just walked out. For half a second, no one spoke. Then he dismissed the thought immediately. "That doesn't matter," he said sharply. "Just open the chamber. We can't." The voice on the tablet sounded near panic now. "The control architecture is running an old prototype system. None of the override codes are working." Marcus frowned. "That's impossible. We upgraded the system years ago, apparently not this section." Victor turned toward the glass again. Below them, Lena was pacing inside the chamber. She knocked weakly on the reinforced door. Marcus watched the oxygen indicator on the lab monitor drop another point. "How long until the chamber atmosphere destabilizes?" he asked. The answer came slowly. 20 minutes, maybe less. Victor's breathing became shallow. "Then open it. We're trying." But the frantic engineers below looked completely lost. Code windows flashed across their monitors. Every attempt failed. Security staff began rushing toward the robotics floor, while alarms continued screaming across the tower. Marcus ran a hand through his hair. "Who designed this system originally?" A senior engineer hesitated. "That architecture is old, pre-merger tech. I think it came from an external consultant." "Name?" "I don't remember." Victor cursed under his breath. Below them, Lena pressed her face against the glass barrier again. She was crying now. The CEO's composure began cracking. "Get someone down there," he shouted. "Break the damn door open." One of the engineers looked up from the console. "You can't break those doors. They're reinforced titanium." "If we damage the chamber while the cooling system is unstable..." He didn't finish the sentence. No one needed him to. Marcus stared at the screen. "Then find the override. We're trying every command we have." Another alert flashed across the system display. Cooling relay failure escalating. Containment pressure rising. Victor turned away from the glass, pacing furiously across the boardroom. His voice dropped into a whisper filled with rage. "How does a billion-dollar facility get locked out of its own systems?" No one answered. Because no one knew. Down in the hallway outside the boardroom, the maintenance girl had stopped walking. She stood quietly near the service elevator, listening to the alarms echo through the tower. Her head tilted slightly. 3 pulses again. Then a grinding mechanical vibration deep beneath the building. Cooling relay channel. Sector C. Exactly where she had heard it earlier. She exhaled slowly. "Yeah," she murmured under her breath. "That's not good." Behind her, the boardroom door burst open. Marcus Delane stepped into the hallway. His expression was tight with panic. He spotted the maintenance girl still standing there. For a moment, he hesitated. Then he asked sharply, "Did you say something earlier about a cooling relay?" She looked at him calmly. "Yeah." Marcus took a step closer. "How did you know?" Before she could answer, Victor's voice shouted from inside the boardroom. "Marcus, get back in here. We need every engineer we have." Marcus hesitated again. Then he turned back toward the room. The maintenance girl watched him go. For a moment she considered leaving. After all, she had been fired. But the alarms kept screaming, and somewhere inside that sealed chamber a frightened child was running out of air. She sighed softly, then picked up her toolkit again. "Guess I'm not off the clock yet." The maintenance girl tightened her grip on the worn metal handle of her toolkit and walked back toward the boardroom. Inside, the atmosphere had completely changed. The earlier arrogance was gone, replaced by frantic movement and rising panic. Executives crowded around screens displaying system diagnostics, while engineers shouted overlapping instructions through communication headsets. The alarms still blared through the building. Victor Hallstrom stood near the glass wall overlooking the robotics floor. his hands pressed against the surface as he stared down at the sealed chamber. Below them, Lena was pacing faster now, her small fists tapped desperately against the transparent barrier. Marcus noticed the girl step back into the room. His eyes narrowed. "You're still here?" She glanced at the screens covering the conference table. "Yeah." Victor turned immediately. "I thought I fired you. You did. Then leave." She didn't move. Instead, her attention shifted toward the massive display screen mounted on the wall. A system diagnostic window flickered across the interface. Cooling relay cascade failure. Containment protocol active. Manual override locked. Her eyes moved across the code automatically. It was old architecture, not just old, familiar. Victor slammed his fist against the glass again. "Why isn't that door open yet?" One of the engineers answered from the console. "The system is rejecting every override command." Marcus leaned over the screen. "Try manual root access." "We did." "And?" "Still locked." Victor grabbed the communication tablet. "Listen to me carefully," he said into the device. "If that chamber doesn't open in the next 5 minutes, sir, threats aren't going to rewrite the system." The engineer's voice cracked with stress. Victor lowered the tablet slowly. For the first time since the alarm began, uncertainty crept across the room. The company that built some of the most advanced robotics technology in the world was helpless against its own machines. Behind them, the maintenance girl studied the screen quietly. Lines of code flickered across the display. She leaned slightly closer. Marcus noticed. "Do you understand what you're looking at?" Her voice stayed calm. "Sort of." Victor turned sharply. "Sort of, yeah." He stared at her like she had just insulted the entire engineering department. "You're a maintenance worker," she nodded. "And?" Marcus folded his arms. "You're saying you understand the system architecture?" The girl didn't answer immediately. Her gaze shifted toward the robotics floor below. Red lights flashed across the lab. Inside the chamber, Lena had stopped knocking. Now she simply stood there, breathing quickly, hands pressed against the glass. The oxygen indicator on the screen ticked down another point. Marcus saw it. "How much time do we have left?" he asked. One of the engineers answered quietly. "Maybe 15 minutes. Victor's composure cracked further. "Then open the damn door. We can't." The room fell silent again, except for the alarm and the constant mechanical hum of the building. The maintenance girl exhaled slowly. Her eyes moved back to the diagnostic display. Cooling relay cascade failure. Containment protocol triggered. She stepped closer to the screen. Victor noticed immediately. "Stop." She froze. "This is restricted equipment," he said sharply. "You don't touch anything in this room." The girl looked at him. Then at the screen. Then back at him. "Sir, the system isn't responding because you're sending commands to the wrong control channel." The room went still. Marcus frowned. "What do you mean?" She pointed at the screen. "That override panel is for the upgraded architecture," one of the engineers spoke up. "That's the only control interface." She shook her head slightly. "No." Her finger moved to a smaller system window buried behind the primary interface. "That one is." Marcus leaned closer. "How do you know that?" "Because the containment system isn't running the new structure." She tapped lightly on the display. "It's running the original prototype grid." The engineers stared. Victor scoffed. "That's impossible. We replaced those systems years ago." She shrugged slightly. "Not this section." Marcus's eyes narrowed. "How would you know that?" The maintenance girl hesitated. Then she said quietly, "Because I've seen this system before." Victor crossed his arms. "You've seen it cleaning the floors underneath it, maybe." She ignored the remark. Instead, she focused on the screen again. Her voice softened slightly. The cooling relay failed first, right? One of the engineers answered automatically. Yes, that triggered the containment lockdown, yes, she nodded once. Then the system is following its emergency cascade sequence. Marcus leaned closer. Meaning, her finger hovered above the console. If you try forcing the main override, the system will reject it every time. Victor sighed impatiently. Why? Because the safety architecture assumes the chamber environment is unstable. The engineers exchanged looks. She continued calmly. To unlock the chamber, you have to stabilize the cooling relay first. Marcus blinked. That relay is underground? Yeah. And it's currently offline, she nodded again. That's why the system is locked. Victor's voice hardened. So, what exactly are you suggesting? The girl picked up her toolkit again. Well? Her eyes flicked toward the service elevator. The relay control panel is in the maintenance corridor under the robotics floor. Marcus slowly turned toward her. You're saying the solution isn't up here? No. Victor stared at her. Then where is it? The maintenance girl lifted the worn toolkit slightly. Downstairs, the word lingered in the boardroom like a quiet challenge. For a moment, no one moved. The alarm still screamed through the building. Red emergency lights flashed across the glass walls while executives stared at the maintenance girl, standing calmly beside their control screens. Marcus was the first to speak. You're saying the cooling relay can be stabilized manually? She nodded. Victor crossed his arms tightly. And you know this because that relay unit still uses the original thermal bypass design. Marcus frowned. What does that mean exactly? It means when the cooling system overloads, it shuts down the entire relay grid to prevent structural damage. Victor gestured toward the screens. We already know that. She shook her head slightly. No, you know what the system is doing. You don't know how it recovers. An engineer turned slowly toward her. And you do? She lifted the toolkit a little. Yeah. Victor exhaled sharply. This is ridiculous. Below them, Lena pressed both palms against the chamber door again. Her small voice couldn't be heard through the thick glass, but her fear was visible. Marcus watched the oxygen monitor tick downward. 13 minutes. He turned back toward the maintenance girl. If the relay resets, the containment system unlocks? Not immediately, she said. But the override commands will start working again. Victor's patience snapped. Enough. The CEO stepped forward, towering over her. You're a janitor who wandered into a board meeting and now you think you're our systems engineer? She didn't flinch. No, he scoffed. Then stop pretending. She tilted her head slightly. I'm not pretending. Marcus noticed something strange in her tone. It wasn't defensive, it was simply factual. Victor pointed toward the door. You were fired 10 minutes ago. Yeah, so leave. She glanced toward the robotics floor again. The oxygen indicator dropped another point. Victor followed her gaze, his jaw tightened. Marcus spoke quietly. What exactly would you need to stabilize the relay? The maintenance girl looked down at her toolkit. 5 minutes. Victor laughed harshly. You expect us to gamble my niece's life on a guess from a maintenance worker? Marcus turned toward him. Victor, our engineers have tried everything. They haven't tried smashing the door. That chamber is reinforced titanium. Victor paced toward the glass wall again. Below them, Lena had stopped pacing. Now she sat on the floor near the chamber door, hugging her knees. Her breathing looked quick. Marcus spoke again. If the relay resets, the system might unlock. Victor shook his head. Might isn't good enough. Marcus lowered his voice. Doing nothing guarantees failure. Silence filled the boardroom. Every executive stared between the sealed chamber and the maintenance girl standing quietly beside the console. Victor ran a hand across his face. "Why should I trust you?" he asked. She answered honestly, "You shouldn't." The room blinked in confusion. Victor frowned. "Excuse me?" She shrugged. I just work here." Marcus studied her expression. It wasn't arrogance, it wasn't desperation. It was calm, like someone describing a mechanical problem instead of a life-or-death emergency. "You really think you can fix it?" Marcus said slowly. She considered the question, then answered carefully. "I think I can reset the relay, and if you can't?" She glanced toward the robotics chamber again, then back at him. "Then nothing changes." Victor looked at the oxygen timer. 11 minutes. His voice dropped into a whisper filled with rage and fear. "If this goes wrong, it already has," she replied gently. Marcus stepped between them. Victor, the CEO, didn't look at him. Marcus continued. "Right now, we're locked out of our own system." Victor remained silent. "Every engineer in this building has tried and failed." Still silence. Marcus gestured toward the girl. "She's the only person offering a different solution." Victor turned slowly toward her. "You understand what happens if you're wrong?" She nodded. "Yeah." He studied her face. "Why would you help us?" That question made the room pause. For the first time, the maintenance girl hesitated. Her eyes drifted toward the chamber again, toward the frightened child inside. Then she answered quietly, "Because she's scared." The simplicity of the response disarmed the room. Victor looked at the chamber, then at the girl. For several long seconds, the billionaire CEO said nothing. Finally, he muttered under his breath, "This is insane." Marcus didn't argue. Victor sighed heavily, then pointed toward the service elevator. 5 minutes. The maintenance girl nodded once. Marcus grabbed a security radio. "I'm going with her." Victor immediately objected. "You're not leaving this room." Marcus gestured toward the monitors. "You need someone downstairs relaying information." Victor hesitated, then waved his hand impatiently. "Fine." Marcus turned toward the girl. "You said the relay is beneath the robotics floor?" "Yeah." "In the maintenance corridors?" Sector C. Marcus picked up the radio. "Security team, clear the service tunnel access under Lab Wing 3, static crackled." "Understood." The maintenance girl walked toward the elevator. Marcus followed quickly. Behind them, the boardroom watched. Victor stood frozen near the glass wall. Down below, Lena remained trapped inside the chamber. The oxygen timer dropped again. 10 minutes. The elevator doors opened. Marcus stepped inside beside the maintenance girl. As the doors slid closed, he finally asked the question that had been bothering him. "How did you know the relay was failing before the alarms started?" She rested the toolkit against her leg, then said simply, "I heard it." The elevator doors slid shut with a metallic thud. For a moment, the only sound inside the small service lift was the distant wail of alarms echoing through the tower. Marcus stared at her. "You heard a cooling relay?" She shrugged slightly. "Machines make patterns. When something breaks, the pattern changes." The elevator dropped quickly through the building. Red emergency lights flickered through the narrow windows of the shaft. Marcus folded his arms. "You're telling me you can diagnose industrial systems by sound alone?" "Not all of them." The lift jolted to a stop. Basement level. The doors opened into a narrow concrete hallway lined with pipes and exposed electrical conduits. The polished luxury of the executive floors vanished instantly. Down here, the building looked honest. Steel, dust, old wiring. Marcus stepped out beside her. Security guards were already clearing the corridor ahead. One of them shouted, "Tunnel access is open." The alarms sounded louder down here, echoing through the maintenance tunnels like sirens in a submarine. The girl moved forward quickly. Marcus followed. "You've worked in this section before?" he asked. Yeah. They reached a heavy metal door marked Relay Control, Sector C. The maintenance girl pushed it open. Inside, the relay chamber hummed with unstable energy. Thick cables ran across the walls into a central control unit the size of a small car. Warning lights flashed across its surface while steam hissed from overheated cooling valves. Marcus stepped inside slowly. Jesus. She walked directly toward the control panel. Yeah, it's worse than I thought. He looked around the room. How long until the relay burns out? She checked a small temperature display. About 7 minutes. Marcus pulled out his radio. Victor, we're in the relay chamber. The CEO's voice exploded through the device. Can it be fixed? Marcus looked toward her. She had already set the toolkit on the floor and opened it. Inside were carefully arranged tools, not cheap equipment. Precision instruments worn from years of use. She picked up a narrow insulated wrench. Maybe, she said. Marcus relayed the answer. Victor's voice sharpened. Maybe is not good enough. Marcus lowered the radio. Do what you can. She crouched beside the control panel and removed a small metal cover. Behind it, a tangled grid of overheating components glowed faintly red. Marcus blinked. You're not even checking the system manual? She shook her head. No time. How do you know what you're doing? She didn't look up. Same way you know where the brake pedal is in a car. Marcus frowned. That's not the same thing. Sure it is. Her hands moved confidently through the relay unit, loosening bolts and pulling aside protective panels. Steam hissed louder. The system temperature warning shifted from red to flashing crimson. Marcus checked his watch. 5 minutes. His radio crackled. Status? Victor demanded. Marcus looked toward her again. She's working. Victor didn't sound convinced. Working on what? Before Marcus could answer, the girl suddenly froze. Marcus felt his stomach drop. What happened? She leaned closer to the panel. Yeah, that doesn't sound good. She reached deeper into the relay housing and carefully rotated a small mechanical switch. The relay emitted a loud grinding vibration. Marcus stepped back instinctively. Is that supposed to happen? Not really. His pulse spiked. Then why are you smiling? She didn't answer immediately. Instead, she tightened another bolt and slid a small metal rod into a side channel. The grinding noise stopped. The relay hum stabilized slightly. Marcus stared. You're stabilizing it temporarily. He grabbed the radio again. Victor, the relay's responding. Upstairs, the boardroom erupted in noise. What do you mean responding? Victor demanded. Marcus glanced at the panel. Temperature dropping, the CEO's voice sharpened with sudden hope. Then the containment system should unlock. She shook her head. Marcus relayed the motion. Victor's voice exploded again. What now? She spoke calmly. The relay was only the first problem. Marcus blinked. What? She wiped a thin layer of oil from her fingers. When the relay failed, the system triggered its Cascade protocol. Marcus felt dread creeping back. And that means the chamber locks won't respond until the main power grid resets. Marcus stared at her. You're saying the engineers upstairs still won't be able to open the door? Not yet. The radio crackled with Victor's voice. Explain. Marcus gestured toward the device. She leaned closer. The system is protecting itself, she said calmly. It won't unlock until it believes the entire infrastructure is stable again. Victor's breathing sounded sharp through the radio. How long will that take? She glanced at the relay panel. 10 minutes. Marcus checked his watch again. 4 minutes of oxygen remained. He swallowed hard. That's not enough. She nodded. I know. Victor's voice turned dangerous. Then what's the solution? The maintenance girl stood up slowly and closed her toolkit. Her expression remained calm. There's another override. Marcus looked at her. Where? She pointed toward the ceiling. Inside the chamber control grid. Marcus blinked. That's inside the robotics lab, yeah. He realized what she meant. You're saying someone has to go up there. Not just up there, she corrected gently. They have to enter the containment system manually. Marcus felt a cold wave of realization. That's impossible. She lifted the toolkit again. Not if you know the access tunnels. Victor's voice came through the radio again. What tunnels? The girl glanced at Marcus, then answered quietly. The maintenance ones your engineers don't know about. The relay chamber fell quiet except for the steadier hum of the cooling system. Marcus stared at her as if the words needed time to settle into reality. You're telling me there's a way into the containment grid from the service tunnels? She nodded once. Yeah. He ran a hand over his face, trying to process the idea. Why weren't we told about these tunnels? She adjusted the strap of her toolkit. They're not meant for executives. Upstairs, Victor's voice exploded through the radio. What tunnels? Marcus lifted the device again. She says there's a maintenance access route into the chamber's control grid. The silence on the other end lasted several seconds. When Victor spoke again, his voice had lost some of its earlier certainty. Why would we design something like that? The girl answered calmly. For emergencies. Marcus looked at her. Then why don't our engineers know about it? She hesitated. Because the answer wasn't technical. It was political. Finally, she said quietly, because the system predates the current engineering teams. Marcus frowned. How old is this architecture? About 15 years, that's before the merger. Yeah, Marcus's mind raced. Who built it? She didn't answer right away. Instead, she walked toward a narrow metal ladder at the back of the relay chamber. It led upward into a cramped access shaft. Marcus watched her grab the first rung. Hold on. She paused. Victor needs details before we send someone crawling through maintenance tunnels. She glanced down. There isn't time for a meeting. Marcus looked at the radio again. Victor was breathing heavily on the other end. Explain the access route, the CEO demanded. The girl spoke calmly while studying the shaft. There's a vertical service channel connecting this relay chamber to the robotics lab's control grid. Marcus repeated the explanation. Victor responded immediately. And it leads directly into the containment chamber? No. Marcus relayed the correction. It connects to the manual override node. Victor sounded confused. Manual override node? The girl leaned back down the ladder slightly. The chamber has a physical unlock switch built into the infrastructure. Marcus blinked. You mean an actual switch? Yeah. Victor's voice sharpened. Why wasn't that part of the control system? She shrugged. Redundancy. Marcus almost laughed. You built $1 billion robotics lab with a hidden-off switch? She corrected him gently. I didn't build it. That sentence hung in the air longer than expected. Marcus tilted his head slightly. You seem pretty familiar with the design. She climbed 2 more rungs. I've seen the schematics. Where? Another pause. Finally, she answered. My dad showed them to me. Marcus looked up at her. Your father worked here? She nodded. Years ago. What was his job? She continued climbing. Consulting engineer. The answer hit Marcus like a missing puzzle piece sliding into place. He turned slowly toward the relay panel behind them. Wait, she stopped again. You said the system architecture was about 15 years old. Yeah, and your father helped design it? Part of it. Marcus felt something shift in his understanding. What was his name? She climbed another step. Elias Vale. Marcus froze. The name echoed faintly in his memory. He had seen it somewhere before. Some old engineering report. A technical proposal, something about early robotics safety infrastructure. Elias Vale, he murmured. Upstairs, Victor heard the name through the radio. For the first time since the crisis began, the CEO went completely silent. Marcus noticed. You know the name? Victor didn't answer immediately. When he finally spoke, his voice sounded strangely distant. He was one of the original architects of the robotics containment systems. Marcus looked back up the ladder. The girl had almost reached the top of the shaft. You're his daughter. She shrugged again. Yeah. Marcus laughed softly in disbelief. We've got an entire engineering department upstairs, and the person who understands the system best is a maintenance worker. She didn't correct him. Because technically, he was right. She was a maintenance worker. That was the job she had now. Marcus lifted the radio again. Victor, the manual override is real. How far away is it? The CEO asked. Marcus looked upward. The girl had reached the hatch leading toward the robotics floor infrastructure, about 20 feet above the relay chamber, and then Marcus hesitated. He glanced at the oxygen timer displayed on the relay monitor. 3 minutes. His throat tightened. And then someone has to crawl through the control grid above the chamber. Victor's voice dropped to a whisper. Is it safe? Marcus looked up. She was already opening the hatch. Probably not, she said calmly. Marcus relayed the answer. The silence from the radio lasted longer this time. Finally, Victor spoke again. Do it. Marcus looked up at her. You heard him. She nodded. Then disappeared into the shaft above. Marcus stepped closer to the ladder. Wait. Her head appeared again through the opening. What? He hesitated. Why are you doing this? She looked at him like the question was obvious. Then she said quietly, because someone has to. Her voice faded upward as she pulled herself through the hatch. Marcus stood at the base of the ladder staring into the narrow shaft, listening to the faint metallic sounds of her moving above the ceiling of the relay chamber. The alarm still echoed through the building. Somewhere far above them, a frightened child was running out of air. Marcus grabbed the ladder and started climbing after her. Hey, wait. Her voice drifted down from the darkness. You don't have to come up here. Marcus kept climbing anyway. Yeah, I do. The shaft was barely wide enough for one person. Pipes and cable bundles ran along the walls, forcing him to twist his shoulders as he climbed. Most executives wouldn't follow a maintenance worker into a crawl space, she said from above. Marcus grunted. Well, most executives didn't just watch their CEO's niece get trapped in a lab. He pushed himself through the hatch and emerged into a cramped maintenance corridor above the robotics floor. The space looked like the inside of a giant machine. Steel beams crossed overhead. Thick bundles of wiring ran across the ceiling. Below them, faint through the metal grating underfoot, the robotics laboratory stretched across the floor. Flashing red lights pulsed upward through the gaps. Marcus crouched beside her. You weren't kidding about hidden tunnels. She stood and started moving quickly through the corridor. Yeah. Most people don't look up. Marcus followed carefully. Where's the manual override node? She pointed ahead. Above the chamber, they moved through the narrow space while the alarms echoed through the structure of the building. Marcus's radio crackled suddenly. Marcus. Victor's voice burst through. Status. Marcus grabbed the device. She's inside the upper control grid. How long? Marcus glanced toward her. She was already kneeling beside a metal service panel. 2 minutes if the path is clear, she said. Marcus repeated the estimate. Victor sounded strained. You have less than that. Marcus didn't ask for clarification. He already knew what that meant. The oxygen timer was nearly finished. She opened the service panel and pulled aside a small protective grate. Beyond it, The infrastructure above the robotics chamber was visible. A dense grid of cables and mechanical supports formed a narrow crawl space directly above the sealed laboratory. Marcus leaned closer. Through the metal framework, he could see the chamber below. Lena was lying on the floor now, not moving much. His chest tightened. How do we reach the override? She pointed downward through the grid. There. Marcus squinted. Hidden within the structure was a small mechanical box mounted along the chamber's control column. That tiny thing? Yeah, and that's the switch? Inside it, Marcus looked at the distance between them and the node. The grid between them was thin, fragile, and clearly not meant to support human weight. You can't walk across that, she shook her head. No, Marcus frowned. Then, how do you reach it? She lifted a small cable hook from her toolkit. Like this. Before he could respond, she attached the hook to one of the steel support beams above them. Marcus's eyes widened. Wait. But she was already lowering herself carefully into the grid. Her boots found narrow support bars barely wider than a finger. Marcus felt his pulse spike. That structure isn't designed for people. Yeah, she said calmly. I noticed. The metal creaked softly as she shifted her weight. Marcus leaned over the opening, gripping the edge of the panel. Be careful. She moved slowly through the framework. Each step precise, each movement deliberate. Below her, the robotics chamber glowed under emergency lights. Lena lay motionless near the sealed door. Marcus checked the time. Less than a minute. His radio crackled again. Marcus. Victor's voice trembled now. Talk to me. Marcus forced himself to answer. She's reaching the override node. Is it working? Marcus looked down. She was still climbing through the grid. Almost. Victor's voice dropped into something quieter. Tell her to hurry. Marcus swallowed. She's moving as fast as she can. The girl finally reached the control column. She hooked one arm around the support beam and reached toward the small metal box. Her fingers slipped slightly on the polished surface. Marcus held his breath. Easy. She steadied herself and pulled the box open. Inside, a single mechanical switch waited. Marcus exhaled. That's it? Yeah. Victor's voice burst through the radio again. Flip it. She paused. Marcus noticed. What's wrong? She studied the wiring inside the box. The relay reset didn't fully stabilize the system. Marcus felt dread creeping in again. What does that mean? If I flip the switch now, the chamber will unlock. That's the goal. Yeah. She glanced down toward the floor. But the power surge might overload the robotics grid. Marcus blinked. You're saying the machines could activate? Possibly. His stomach dropped, and Lena is right next to them. She nodded slowly. Marcus grabbed the radio. Victor, there's a complication. The radio crackled with heavy static before the CEO's voice came through again. What complication? Marcus kept his eyes locked on the fragile grid beneath them, where the girl clung to the support beam above the chamber. If she flips the switch right now, Marcus said slowly, the chamber unlocks, but the power surge could trigger the robotics system. For a moment, Victor said nothing. Below them, the machine stood frozen under emergency lights, industrial robotic arms designed to move with crushing force during automated tests. If those arms activated while Lena was lying on the floor, Marcus pushed the thought away. Victor's voice returned, tight and strained. How high is the risk? Marcus glanced down at her. She answered quietly. 50. Marcus relayed the number. The silence on the radio lasted several seconds. When Victor spoke again, the arrogance was gone. Is there another option? She studied the wiring inside the small control box again. There might be. Marcus leaned forward. What? if I can reroute the power flow through the relay grid first. Marcus blinked. That's possible from here? Yeah. She pointed toward a narrow cable cluster running along the chamber's support column. But I have to disconnect the surge line manually. Marcus followed her gaze. The cable was several feet away from her current position. Between them stretched the weakest part of the support grid. Metal bars no wider than pencils. Marcus shook his head. That structure won't hold you. She glanced at the distance. I know, then how do you reach it? She reached into the toolkit hanging from her belt and pulled out a small insulated clamp. Marcus recognized the device. Electrical bypass tool? She nodded. I can hook the clamp to the surge cable and redirect the power through the relay circuit. Marcus frowned. That sounds extremely dangerous, yeah. His radio crackled again. Marcus, Victor said quietly, tell me what's happening. Marcus explained the plan. Victor didn't respond immediately. When he finally spoke, his voice carried something unfamiliar. Fear. If she does that, will Lena be safe? Marcus looked down again. The girl balanced carefully on the thin framework while studying the cable route. If it works, Marcus said. And if it doesn't? Marcus hesitated. She answered for him. The grid might overload. Victor understood instantly. That means the chamber systems activate. Yeah. Marcus heard Victor exhale heavily through the radio. For a moment, the powerful CEO sounded like nothing more than a worried uncle. How long until the oxygen runs out? Marcus checked the relay monitor display on his phone. 30 seconds. He looked back down at her. We're out of time. The girl shifted her weight slightly and tested the nearest support bar with her boot. The metal creaked softly. Marcus felt sweat run down the back of his neck. Are you sure about this? She glanced up at him. No. That answer somehow made the moment more honest. Below them, Lena stirred weakly on the chamber floor. Marcus tightened his grip on the edge of the opening. Can you reach the cable? Barely. And once you clamp it? The surge should divert through the relay circuit instead of the robotics grid. Marcus nodded slowly. That stabilizes the chamber. Yeah, and then you flip the switch. Exactly. Marcus lifted the radio. Victor, she's about to try. The CEO didn't answer right away. When he finally spoke, his voice had become very quiet. Tell her, thank you. Marcus relayed the message. She didn't say anything back. Instead, she carefully stepped onto the next support bar. The metal flexed under her weight. Marcus held his breath. Easy. She reached for the next beam. Another creak echoed through the grid. Below them, the chamber lights flickered again. Marcus glanced at Lena. The child wasn't moving anymore. His chest tightened. Hurry. The girl reached the cable cluster and steadied herself against the chamber column. She clipped the insulated clamp around the thick surge cable. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the relay monitor on Marcus's phone blinked. Power flow rerouting. Temperature stabilizing. Marcus exhaled in disbelief. You did it. She checked the cable connection once more. Not yet. Marcus frowned. What do you mean? She pointed toward the switch inside the control box. The chamber still needs to be unlocked. Marcus grabbed the radio. Victor. The surge is diverted. The response came instantly. Open the chamber. Marcus looked down at her. She repositioned herself beside the control box again. One hand gripping the beam, the other hovering over the switch. She glanced at Marcus. Ready? He nodded. Ready. Before we see what happens when she flips that switch, hit subscribe so you don't miss the moment everything changes. She took a breath, then reached for the lever. Her fingers wrapped around the small metal lever. For a split second, the entire world seemed to hold its breath. Marcus leaned forward over the opening, every muscle in his body tense as he watched her grip the switch inside the control box. "Is the surge still stable?" he asked. She glanced at the clamp attached to the cable. The insulated bypass tool hummed faintly. "Yeah." Marcus raised the radio again. "Victor, she's about to do it." Static crackled across the line before the CEO answered. "Open the chamber." His voice sounded different now. Not commanding. Pleading. Below them, Lena remained curled on the laboratory floor beside the sealed door. The emergency lights reflected across the glass walls of the chamber while the machines around her stood frozen like silent giants. Marcus felt his throat tighten. "Do it," he whispered. She nodded once. Then she pulled the lever. For half a second nothing happened. Then the entire chamber shuddered. A deep mechanical thud echoed through the structure as the containment locks disengaged. Marcus's radio exploded with voices from the boardroom. "The override is responding. Pressure levels stabilizing. Door mechanisms activating." Marcus looked down again. The massive reinforced chamber door began to unlock. Steel bolts slid back into the wall with heavy grinding sounds. Marcus exhaled in relief. It's working, but the moment of celebration lasted only a second, because the robotics grid suddenly flickered. Marcus's eyes snapped upward. What was that? She looked at the cable clamp. The surge line pulsed once. Then again, the diverted power struggled to stabilize inside the relay system. Marcus felt dread creep back into his chest. "Tell me that's normal." She didn't answer immediately. Instead, she watched the wiring carefully. The clamp vibrated. Then suddenly, one of the robotic arms inside the chamber twitched. Marcus froze. Oh no. Below them, a massive steel arm slowly rotated above one of the workstations. The emergency power grid had partially activated the robotics system. Marcus grabbed the radio. "Victor, the machines are powering up." The response from upstairs was immediate chaos. "What do you mean powering up?" "The grid is rebooting." Marcus looked back down. The chamber door was halfway open now. But Lena was lying directly beneath one of the robotic arms. If the system fully restarted, Marcus swallowed hard. "Can you stop it?" he asked her. She quickly checked the cable again, the relay still stabilizing. Another robotic arm jerked slightly as power pulsed through the system. Marcus felt his pulse spike. How long? 30 seconds, Marcus almost laughed. "We don't have 30 seconds. Below them, the chamber door continued grinding open. But Lena wasn't moving. Marcus leaned farther over the opening. "Lena," he shouted instinctively. Of course she couldn't hear him through the thick chamber glass. The robotic arm above her shifted again, slow, heavy. Marcus's voice dropped into panic. "Arya, we need that system stable now." She was already adjusting the clamp. The surge cable buzzed louder. "Come on," she murmured. The relay monitor on Marcus's phone flickered, power levels fluctuating. Another robotic unit twitched. Marcus looked back down. The chamber door was finally fully open, but Lena still hadn't moved. "Victor," Marcus shouted into the radio. "The door's open. Get her out." Victor yelled back. Marcus looked helplessly toward the floor, where above the chamber someone has to reach her. Security teams were already sprinting across the laboratory floor toward the door, but they were still too far away, and the robotic arms were beginning to move faster. Marcus looked at her again. "Can the clamp hold?" Almost. The cable sparked faintly. The surge pressure surged once more. Then suddenly, the relay monitors stabilized. Power flow rerouted successfully. The robotic arms froze mid-motion. Marcus stared at the screen. "You did it." She quickly checked the connection again. Yeah. Below them, the machines went silent again. Security officers burst through the chamber doorway seconds later. Marcus leaned over the opening. "Over here." he shouted. The guards spotted Lena immediately. One of them scooped the child into his arms, while another shielded her from the surrounding equipment. Marcus collapsed back against the metal beam with a long breath. "She's safe." The radio crackled. Victor's voice came through, shaky. "Marcus, is she okay?" Marcus looked down as the guards carried Lena out of the chamber. "Yeah," Victor exhaled loudly. For a moment, the only sound in the tunnel was the fading echo of alarms. Marcus finally looked back toward the girl balancing on the grid. "You should probably climb back up before that structure gives up." She carefully secured the clamp and moved back toward the service panel. The metal creaked softly again as she stepped across the beams. Marcus extended a hand when she reached the opening. She grabbed it and pulled herself up beside him. For a few seconds, neither of them spoke. Then Marcus laughed softly. "You know something?" She tilted her head. "What?" He shook his head in disbelief. The CEO fired the only person in this building who knew how to save his niece. Marcus let the sentence hang there as the alarms across the tower slowly began to quiet. For the first time since the crisis began, the building felt like it was breathing again. Below them, security teams were already rushing Lena toward the medical station near the robotics lab entrance. Engineers flooded the chamber to shut down the remaining systems while emergency lights flickered back to normal. Marcus leaned back against the metal beam and looked at the girl beside him. "You just saved this entire building," he said. She wiped a streak of machine oil from her hands with a rag from her toolkit. "I fixed a relay." Marcus laughed softly. "That's not how the people upstairs are going to see it." His radio crackled. "Marcus." Victor's voice was steadier now, but the weight in it hadn't disappeared. Marcus grabbed the device. "She's safe." There was a pause. Then Victor asked quietly, "And the system?" Marcus looked toward the grid where the clamp still held the surge cable steady. "Stable." Another long silence. Finally, Victor said something no one in that company had probably heard him say before. "Bring her upstairs." Marcus glanced toward the girl. "Victor wants to see you." She shrugged slightly. "Okay." They crawled back through the service corridor and climbed down the ladder into the relay chamber again. The system was humming steadily now. Steam had stopped leaking from the cooling valves. Marcus checked the monitor. All systems normal. He looked at her again. "You know every engineer upstairs is going to want to ask you 1,000 questions." She closed her toolkit calmly. "They should ask my dad." Marcus hesitated. "He's gone, right?" She nodded once. "Yeah." The elevator ride back up felt strangely quiet compared to the chaos earlier. The alarms had stopped. The emergency lights were fading. When the doors opened on the executive floor, the boardroom was already full. Executives. Engineers. Security. Everyone had gathered around the glass wall overlooking the robotics lab. When Marcus and the maintenance girl stepped into the room, dozens of heads turned. The entire company had watched the rescue unfold through security cameras. And now they were seeing the person responsible. Victor Hallstrom stood near the window. His jacket was off. His tie hung loose around his collar. The powerful CEO who had humiliated her less than an hour ago looked different, more human. He stepped toward them slowly. For a moment, no one spoke. Then Victor looked directly at the girl. "You saved my niece." She shifted the toolkit in her hand. "She's okay?" Victor nodded. "The doctors say she'll be fine." Relief flickered briefly across her face. Marcus noticed. Victor studied her quietly. "I owe you an apology." The words surprised the entire room. Victor Hallstrom did not apologize to people, especially not maintenance workers. But he continued anyway. "I fired you today," he said, "in front of my entire company." She didn't respond. You warned us about the relay before the alarms even started. Marcus watched the executives exchange glances. Victor exhaled slowly. And you came back anyway. She tilted her head slightly. There was a kid trapped in a lab, Victor nodded. Yes. He looked around the room at the stunned engineers and executives watching. Does anyone here know who designed the original containment system in Lab Wing 3? No one answered. Finally, one of the senior engineers spoke. I believe it was Elias Vale. Victor turned back toward the girl. And who is Elias Vale? She answered simply. My dad. A ripple of realization moved across the room. Marcus saw several engineers suddenly stiffen. One of them whispered to another. Wait, Vale designed the entire safety architecture. Victor nodded slowly. Yes, he turned toward the stunned executives around the room. The system that saved Lena today exists because of Elias Vale. The room fell silent. Victor looked back at the girl standing in the center of the boardroom with her worn toolkit. And apparently, he said quietly, his daughter understood it better than all of us. For the first time since the meeting began earlier that day, the balance of power in the room had completely shifted, not because she demanded it, not because she proved it with words, but because everyone in that building had just watched what happened when the person they ignored was the only one who knew how to fix the problem. The boardroom stayed silent long after Victor finished speaking. Executives who had laughed earlier now stood stiffly around the table, their attention fixed on the quiet girl holding a worn toolkit. The shift in the room was impossible to ignore. An hour ago she had been invisible. Now every engineer in Hallstrom Dynamics was staring at her like she was the missing page in a manual they'd been trying to read for years. One of the senior engineers stepped forward. You said your father showed you the system's schematics. She nodded. He used to bring them home. The man blinked. You studied them? Sometimes. Marcus rubbed the back of his neck, still trying to process it all. Sometimes, he repeated softly. Victor watched the exchange carefully. His gaze moved from the girl to the executives around the table. You heard her earlier, he said. She warned us about the cooling relay before the alarms even started. The room grew uncomfortable. Because that part was true. And they had laughed. Marcus spoke up. She didn't just hear the relay, he added. She diagnosed the Cascade failure before the engineers upstairs even understood the problem. A murmur spread through the group. Victor slowly walked toward the center of the boardroom. I built this company on the belief that intelligence and innovation could come from anywhere, he said. His voice was steady again. But today, I proved something else. No one interrupted him. Victor looked at the executives who had been laughing earlier. Sometimes the people we overlook understand our systems better than the people running them. Several of the engineers shifted awkwardly. One of them finally spoke. With respect, sir, none of us were trained on the original architecture. Victor turned to him. And yet the maintenance worker was. The engineer had no response. Marcus leaned slightly against the conference table. You might want to see something else, he said. Victor raised an eyebrow. Marcus pulled out his phone and opened the relay monitoring feed. Security cameras had recorded everything that happened in the maintenance tunnels and control grid. The screen displayed the moment she climbed across the fragile infrastructure above the chamber. Several executives leaned closer. Marcus tapped the video forward. The clip showed her attaching the clamp to the surge cable. Another clip showed the moment the override switch released the containment locks. The entire room watched quietly. Victor folded his arms. So while my engineering department searched for software solutions, she physically rerouted the system. Marcus nodded. Old school engineering. One of the younger technicians whispered quietly. That clamp redirect was genius. Another engineer shook his head slowly. I wouldn't have even thought of that. Victor turned back toward her again. You said your father was a consulting engineer. Yeah. He left the company after the merger, she nodded. That's what he said. Victor's expression darkened slightly. I remember the disagreement. Marcus glanced at him. You knew him? Victor sighed. Elias Vale believed the company was focusing too much on profit and not enough on safety infrastructure. Several engineers exchanged glances. Marcus frowned, and he was right. Victor didn't argue. Instead, he looked back at the girl. Your father fought to keep the manual override systems in place. She listened quietly. He said every automated system needed a simple mechanical escape. Marcus nodded slowly. Which is exactly what saved Lena today. Victor looked around the room again. Without that manual switch, the containment protocol would have remained locked. One of the engineers spoke carefully. Sir, that also means our current infrastructure still depends on technology designed by Elias Vale. Victor nodded once. Yes, he turned back to the girl. And apparently his best student. She looked slightly uncomfortable with the attention. I just remembered what he showed me. Marcus chuckled softly. You remembered enough to save a child and prevent a robotics cascade. The room finally allowed a few quiet laughs. Not mocking ones. Respectful ones. Victor walked toward the large glass wall overlooking the robotics lab. Below them, the emergency teams had completely shut down the chamber. Medical staff were guiding Lena and her parents through the corridor toward the elevators. Victor watched silently for a moment. Then he turned back. When I fired you earlier, he said I called you a janitor wandering where you didn't belong. The room listened carefully. That statement was wrong. He stepped closer to her. You didn't wander into the wrong place. He gestured toward the entire building. You understood this place better than the people running it. She didn't respond. Victor extended his hand. I'd like to offer you your job back. Marcus raised an eyebrow slightly. Victor continued. But not the one you had this morning. The room held its breath again. Victor Hallstrom lowered his hand slowly, not in hesitation but in consideration. For once, the billionaire CEO wasn't trying to control the room. He was choosing his words carefully. I don't think a maintenance assistant is the right position for someone who just stabilized a containment cascade and prevented a robotics activation. A few engineers exchanged amused looks. Marcus folded his arms, curious to see where this was going. Victor continued. I'd like to offer you a position inside our engineering division. The proposal echoed quietly through the boardroom. Some of the engineers nodded immediately. Others still looked stunned. But the girl didn't react the way everyone expected. She didn't smile. She didn't rush to accept. Instead, she shifted the toolkit in her hand again and looked toward the glass wall overlooking the robotics lab. Down below, Lena was leaving the floor surrounded by medical staff and security. The child glanced up toward the observation deck. For a brief moment, their eyes met. The girl lifted her hand in a small wave. Lena smiled weakly. Only then did she turn back toward the CEO. I appreciate the offer, she said calmly. Victor waited. But I'm not an engineer. Several engineers in the room almost laughed. Marcus spoke first. You absolutely are. She shook her head slightly. My dad was the engineer. Victor studied her expression. And he taught you. Some things. Marcus leaned against the table. You crawled through a containment grid, rerouted a power surge, and manually unlocked a robotics chamber. He pointed toward the lab below. That's engineering. The room murmured agreement. But she still looked uncertain. Victor seemed to understand why. Your father left this company because he believed we were forgetting what engineering is supposed to protect, he said quietly. She listened. He believed systems should protect people first. Marcus nodded slowly. That manual override switch proved he was right. Victor looked at the toolkit in her hands. The tools you used today were probably his. She glanced down at them. The metal edges were worn smooth from years of work. Yeah. Victor folded his arms. Then, maybe the best way to honor him is to keep doing what he taught you. The room went quiet again, not because they were waiting for a dramatic answer, but because everyone there had already seen what she was capable of. She looked around the boardroom. The same executives who had laughed earlier were now watching her with genuine respect. The same engineers who had dismissed the problem were now studying her like a colleague. Marcus gave a small shrug. You don't have to decide today. Victor nodded. But the offer stands. She thought about it for a moment. Then she gave a small nod. Okay. The room relaxed slightly. Marcus grinned. Welcome to engineering. She lifted the toolkit slightly. I'm keeping these, though. Victor smiled faintly. Good. He turned toward the executives around the table. I think we all learned something today. One of the younger engineers spoke up that sometimes the person fixing the floor understands the building better than the people running it. Marcus laughed. Exactly. Victor walked back toward the glass wall one last time. The robotics lab below was calm again. The machines were silent. The emergency lights were gone. The crisis had passed. But the lesson remained. Because earlier that morning, a powerful CEO had fired a quiet orphan girl in front of everyone. And by the end of the day, that same girl had saved the life of the person he loved most. Not with authority, not with status, but with knowledge that no one had bothered to notice. Sometimes the people standing quietly in the background are the ones holding everything together. And sometimes the loudest mistake a leader can make is underestimating the quiet ones. Now tell me something. What title should our next story be? Subscribe and don't miss our next story. They mocked the quiet mechanic at the airport until the plane's engine failed. Trust me, you'll feel it, and tell me in the comments, what injustice should we tackle next?